to pick up on just a very interesting detail in the story of the Exodus. We're told in Exodus 12 that as the children of Israel were leaving, and we saw this morning that there had been this critical crisis that had come on the Egyptians through 10 plagues, the last one being the death of the firstborn. And eventually, in the middle of the night, Pharaoh calls a kind of regal council, and they say, we need to get rid of them. And so he calls Moses and Aaron, doesn't wait till the morning, and he says, leave. And so in Exodus 12, we see a little detail of this departure, and it's quite dramatic and sudden. We're told in verse 33 that they were the Egyptians wanted them to get out because they were worried that they might all die. And the urgency is communicated because they take this bread without any yeast. And so the dough hadn't been able to rise. And I'm not sure if this was to do with the cooking of bread at night. I imagine they probably did something like that so you would have fresh bread in the morning. But the idea is of grabbing the bread before it's even cooked, before you've added the yeast so it can rise, to get out. So it gives this sense of urgency that we have. And then in verse 35, we were told that they all did, the Israelites did as Moses had instructed them. And they then went and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably dispossessed toward the people, and they gave what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. It's a really interesting little detail here in terms of two verses. So there's this urgency, there's this need to depart. The Egyptians are wanting to depart. The Israelites are wanting to depart. We see the urgency in terms of bread. And yet, before they go, they turn around to the Egyptians and basically say, you wouldn't like to make a donation to our cause. And I'm sort of in there. They're not looking for second-hand goods here. They're sort of, the question must have been, what are you looking for? And it's like, well, silver, gold, your high-end clothing, your designer wear, and they take it, and again, it's not that they just take it; they've asked for it, but it suggests that they're favorably disposed towards the people, which suggests that God was somehow in the midst of this accruing of silver and gold and clothing, that it was something that God was facilitating, and so we see that the Israelites are successful in the request for gold and silver to the Egyptians. Now, this raises a whole series of very interesting questions and paradigms for us in terms of our modern situation. Some of you will have grown up watching Harrison Ford. Now, Harrison Ford, his famous movies are Raiders of the Lost Ark and the initial Star Wars trilogy. It was a shame they didn't leave it there, but anyway, that's personal. And so Harrison Ford made his name in those movies, but his initial breakthrough movie, the movie that kind of put him on the stage, or center stage as a Hollywood actor, was a movie called The Witness, and it came out in the early 80s. If you ever get a chance, it's probably on Netflix or whatever, it's worth watching. Very interesting movie. In fact, I think it may even have won a few Oscars, but it was about a child who witnessed a murder, and the child came from an Amish community in, I think it was Philadelphia, and Harrison Ford was given the task of protecting the child, and so he had to go and stay in an Amish community. And if you don't know who the Amish are, they're a group, their tradition is Anabaptist, and they believe in a radical separation between the church and the world. And this radical separation takes the expression in the disavowing of any technology. So they won't drive cars. They won't even have zips on their clothing because that's seen as a modern thing. And so as they attempt to disavow the culture around them, they create their own kind of distinctive culture. And it's fascinating. I know there are tourist trips if you ever get back to America. Sometimes it's worth going to see and visiting these communities. But it creates a very interesting question, and the Amish witness creates a very interesting question, which is, what is the relationship between Christians and the culture around them? And what should that look like? And sort of at the two opposite ends of this question, you have cultural appropriation, which is that the church should not be distinct from the culture. Anabaptist or Baptist tradition is not keen on that. And that's partly why the Amish are born out of that. But you have one extreme, which is basically you really shouldn't be able to distinguish the church from the culture because the church is the culture. And so you get this idea that being British is the same as being Church of England. And that kind of notion out there. And then the other extreme is that the church should have nothing to do with the culture, and it should endeavor to keep itself entirely and utterly separate from the culture. And it's an interesting question in terms of what is the relationship of the church to the culture around it. And it's also a very interesting question to consider in the light of this paradigm that we seem to have in the Exodus story. Cultural appropriation and how people answer it. And as I say, you can have lots of different positions, and I haven't got time tonight to go through them all. There are some very good books. There's a very good book called Christ and Culture, which lays out 6 positions, and you might find that worth reading. But in terms of cultural appropriation, the way that people often address this is they say that the things that we find in culture are not evil in and of themselves. So culture is essentially neutral. And really it's to do with the way that the thing gets used. So, and the silver and gold the Israelis probably took from the Egyptians may have been taken from a ritualistic context, may have been used in worship, may actually conform to, they may have been carrying idols with them, as we will see later on in the story, and yet they took it. And there's an interesting question in terms of, is it because the medium is actually neutral in itself? It's essentially silver and gold and clothing. And the only thing that makes it good or bad is not the thing in and of itself, but how you choose to deploy it and use it. Again, when I was young, there was a lot of debate about Christian music. And there was a group of people who believed that, and this was pretty normative through the 60s and 70s, who believed that Christians should not engage in any form of rock music. So anything with a beat was demonic. And in fact, I actually wrote a book, I have to confess this, when I was 18, called The New Babylon. And it was kind of on this theme. And I do have a copy if anybody ever wants to see it. And but the idea was, that if you're a Christian, you can't listen to rock music because it is intrinsically evil and wrong. And so the idea of incorporating drums into worship or anything like that in church would be seen as a compromise, but not only compromise, but actually a satanic attack on the church. There were others, and there was a particular musician, guy called Larry Norman, who kind of led the charge. And he picked up a statement from the Salvation Army. General Booth was once asked, why do you guys play brass bands and this sort of thing? And he goes, and General Booth answered and said, why should the devil have all the good music? And this guy, Larry Norman, wrote a rock song called Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music? And it was covered by Cliff Richard subsequently. But at the heart of this debate was the whole idea of that rock music, or music itself, or drums, or electric guitars, were in themselves neutral. They were neither good nor bad, but they could be purposed in particular ways which would either serve an evil end or a good end. And a lot of people have used this argument in terms of cultural appropriation. So you'll discover in our church, for instance, we'll use audiovisual. And there's nothing inherently Christian about audiovisual, but neither is there anything contrary to Christianity in terms of audiovisuals. And by the way, audiovisuals didn't appear in the New Testament, just in case you're wondering. Yeah, it does appear in our modern church. Why? Because cultural appropriation is actually part of what we do. And repurposing mediums to communicate in a particular way is an appropriate thing to do. I once heard a talk, a very unusual talk about the way preachers should dress. And you kind of think, wow, that must have been in the Dark Ages. But it was a very interesting point that was being made, which was, if you as a preacher dressed like the Apostle Paul, you would not engage with your community because you'd be wearing a toga. And if I came up here in a toga, you would all be sitting there going, what on earth is that guy doing? So cultural appropriation, dressing in a reasonably contemporary fashion, not like contemporary, but a reasonably contemporary fashion is about cultural appropriation. The further step that people take in terms of a cultural appropriation is in relation to things that are even purposed for bad reasons. And the idea that things can be restored because they belong to God anyway. In the New Testament, we see stories of this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul deals with the whole question of meat that was sacrificed to idols. And some people were really struggling with this because they were saying, this meat has been purposed for an evil end. So it's not about purposing, it's actually been purposed. So surely the fact that it comes from a ritualistic setting makes it prohibited for us as Christians to touch or have anything to do with. And Paul, in very clever arguments, and at some point we'll have to look at those arguments in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, discusses this issue. But the bottom line, really where he sort of starts from, which is, all of this stuff belongs to God anyway. And again, back to Larry Norman, but the idea that rock music may actually belong to God, and that we might have rock music in heaven. I know some of you will find that traumatic, but the idea that actually, all of the material world and all of the things and all of the silver and all of the gold and all of the clothing ultimately belongs to God in the first place. So even if something has been deployed for a wrong purpose, there is this concept there of restoration, of taking back that which belongs to God. The phrase of plundering the Egyptians is seen in the text that we're looking at. And it's this idea of taking back what has been misappropriated for some other purpose or end. And again, I think there's a very powerful idea there for us as Christians in terms of reclaiming things that have been misappropriated. I know a group of Christians who divided the whole of culture or society into kind of 7 spheres and talk about politics and economics and the arts, and about these things have been misappropriated in media, have been misappropriated by forces that are contrary to God in many instances. And we as Christians shouldn't be separating ourselves from them and saying, let's have nothing to do with this. Economics are evil, or politics are wrong and dangerous and will compromise you, or the arts will pollute you. Let's destroy anything in our churches that might entertain us in any fashion. And actually what we need to do is actually take this stuff back because it ultimately belongs to God. Government, economics, arts, media ultimately belongs to God himself. And this notion of restoration and reappropriation, of taking back that which belongs to God. And again, I think there is a notion here in this Exodus account of doing that. I know that there are Christians in politics who have very much that sense of we need to take back the political agenda for God. and engage with it. But the third area, and this is the sort of the third way that this text is sometimes used and interpreted, relates to whether we should take money from non-Christian sources. And my father was very fond of this text when talking about receiving and taking money from government agencies, and church applying for monies out with the Christian community itself. And again, some Christians feel that that's wrong to do that. Others think it's okay to do it in some measure, but not in other measure. So for instance, when we give money in our churches, if you pay tax, you can reclaim that tax. And most Christians, I think, are okay with that we actually take that tax back from the government. Although some people would say, why are you not just letting the government have their taxes? And but most of us would be okay, partly because it would shut most of the churches in the UK in a fail swoop if that wasn't the case. Yet when it comes to other funding sources, Christians get more uncomfortable. And it would be wrong to say that there are straightforward answers in relation to this stuff. Is it compromise to take from profane sources? You know, and if we think, and the obvious one that we have in our society is the National Lottery. If you take money from the National Lottery, do you become complicit in the whole edifice of gambling and addiction and the abuses that causes? Again, one of the things that lockdown has caused is incredible issues in terms of gambling in our culture and society. And, you know, as Christians, we actually should be raising serious concerns about some of the accessibility and the addictiveness of some of the gambling apps that are out there, a real evil within our culture that impacts family and relationships and individuals in terrible ways. And things like the National Lottery are kind of part of that. And then you take stuff, are you not then encouraging the immorality of gambling? Are you not encouraging the misuse of monies in terms of these things? And so people feel very strongly that actually if the church bows the knee to these things, then you are compromised and complicit. And it's a difficult one. Difficult one when you go in to buy your clothes. You know, you go into Next or, sorry, I don't go shopping that much. Or some of the other stores where you'll get cheap clothing. And I'll often do this if I'm going on a foreign trip. You know, I'll go in and pick up half a dozen shirts that cost next to nothing, stick them in my luggage, and then dump them and not bring them home. And you sit there and you think, probably in order to produce something that cheaply at that cost so I can do that has massive ramifications in some part of the world somewhere else. And by engaging in this, I'm complicit. And it's like, where do you draw the lines in terms of these things? Yet there's also another side to this, which is the whole idea of if Christians don't repurpose and reclaim that, then what happens to that? And so there's a counter-argument to the argument that says you're complicit if you engage, which is if you don't engage, you're complicit. So what happens is monies that could be used by the church to forward social programs, to change people's lives, end up going to pay for lights in sports fields, or worse still, get used to fund things that we would identify as probably immoral causes that are being funded through this monies. And Christians, by not engaging, actually then become complicit, and maybe they feel puritanical, but hey, actually it's that disengagement that we see in these things. It's very interesting in this story as they took the silver and gold of Egypt, and it says that they plundered Egypt. It's interesting to wonder what was going through their heads. what was actually going through their heads, which was, if God has granted us favor, and it's not that the Egyptians just said, here you are, have this. They actually asked for it. They went and asked for it because God said, ask for it. And you wonder what was going on. You kind of feel like having a conversation with God and say, don't you realize, God, a lot of the silver and gold will have been from sacred places. A lot of this will have been used to worship foreign gods. A lot of this stuff will be from the oppressive Egyptian society and be a consequence of that. And yet you are saying to the people, take this and reuse it and repurpose it. A fascinating episode. Interestingly enough, if you read on, you'll discover that the children of Israel fail in using this resource in the way that God wants them to use it, and it ends up actually being turned into a golden calf. But here at this point, God saw some repurposing and redemption in terms of these sources. So they took something that had belonged to the pagan gods, to pagan society, and made it the possession of Yahweh. And I guess what I'm saying this evening is there are no straightforward answers to this. But I think that a position where we completely capitulate to culture is wrong, but equally a position where we completely distance ourselves and disengage from our culture is wrong. Interestingly, we become complicit both sometimes if we take money, but also if we don't take money. We sometimes also lose sight of the fact that God is actually the owner of all material things, and it's God's anyway. And we sometimes lose sight of the need and the calling of a Christian community to repossess and take hold of that which belongs to God. Let's pray together. Lord God, I thank you for the story in Exodus, and I thank you for the lessons that it teaches us. Lord, I pray that as we wrestle with the whole question of cultural appropriation and what it means to be Christians living in the context that we do, what it means for us as Christians to be engaging with our culture, what it means for us as Christians to actually be proclaiming your lordship in every sphere of life over all material things, but also over the political and the artistic and the material and the economic. Lord, I just pray that you would help us understand what it means to be a Christian witness and to witness to your reality. Lord, I pray as we struggle with questions regarding sources of funding and what are appropriate sources and what are inappropriate sources, as we struggle over questions about our shopping habits and what's appropriate to buy and what is not appropriate to buy. Lord, just help us to have real wisdom and to discern what it means to be a people who point to your lordship and to live in a right way in relation to that lordship. Lord, I ask this in your name. Amen.